Hello, and welcome to the Early American Brass Band podcast. I'm Chris Triano, joined by Stephen Canistraci.
Hello.
Oh, you went low this time.
Yeah, change it up.
And welcome to episode number 4. On this episode, we will be discussing early American brass bands with famed band leader Dr. Kirby Jolly. Kirby Jolly was the leader of the Old Bethpage Village brass band on Long Island, and is perhaps most well known for their involvement in the Ken Burns documentary, The Civil War. The Old Bethpage Brass Band, under Kirby Jolly's direction, was featured on that album on a number of the tracks. And Kirby Jolly was also cornetist with the Goldman Band in New York. So a very knowledgeable person, and we were incredibly blessed to have Dr. Kirby Jolly agree to speak with us earlier last week. Before we move on to the interview with Dr. Kirby Jolly, I'd like to quickly go over to our next segment of the show that we've cleverly titled Corrections, just to touch base back on last episode number 3, featuring Dr. Mark Jenkins. There was some talk about the instrumentation of brass bands in the 19th century. It was mentioned that in the 1800s, brass bands would sometimes utilize double B-flat bass tubas as their bottom voice, and even below that, the double E-flat bass. And we just wanted to note the correction that the bottom of brass bands in the 19th century typically were just the regular E-flat bass as their lowest voice. The B-flat bass was actually a tenor-voiced instrument, much like a common euphonium or baritone of today. It's just a wider board tenor-voiced instrument. So that's the B-flat bass, and then the E-flat bass below that, which is like an E-flat tuba today. Thank you for allowing us to make that correction, and now we can move on to the highlight of the episode. So we hope you enjoyed this interview with Dr. Kirby Jolly of the Old Bethpage Brass Band.
Roll that tape.
So welcome, Dr. Jolly. Thank you so much for coming on to the Early American Brass Band podcast with Stephen Canistraci and myself. Before we get deeper into your research and your time with the Old Bethpage Brass Band, would you mind telling us a little bit about your early days, maybe when you started playing your instrument, or what got you into playing in bands in the early stages?
Well, I started playing in elementary school in the 6th grade, and we purchased an instrument that came with 44 lessons, and that was my start. The school had a band. I remember joining the big circle, and it was straight on. I was sort of naturally, I was a natural. It came right easy for me.
Now, is that on trumpet? Was that on trumpet or cornet?
Trumpet or cornet. Trumpet. I wasn't into cornet playing at the time.
Oh, okay. And were you the first one? Were you the first one in your family to play an instrument?
No, I was the first one in my family, and it came very quickly to me. And I remember playing in little bands, and that was in Cleveland, Ohio, at the elementary school. And I started junior high, and we soon moved to Long Island, New York, where I was sorry to see that they had no instrumental music program. And when I graduated from the 8th grade at the PS 136, we formed a little band, a 5-piece band, which included an accordion.
Wow.
When did you form that group? That was when you were still in school?
Well, it was when I graduated from the 8th grade.
Oh, okay.
Before high school, that would have been probably around January 1944.
And then you went on, right? After high school, did you continue in college in music? Were you a music major?
I played an awful lot as a teenager in young bands, and I went to college, Syracuse University, on a full scholarship, and I played in all of the university ensembles. And at Syracuse, I also played a lot of club dates and various theaters and the Syracuse Symphony. So the town of Syracuse did more for me than university did.
Gotcha. I didn't know that there was that large of a music scene in Syracuse.
Yeah, well, I had a lot of private students and a lot of club dates and with the symphony and vaudeville shows were coming to the theaters like one a month, and I played them all as a student.
Uh-huh. And then that was as a trumpet major, like performance, or were you music education?
Music education. And I did get a Bachelor of Education degree at Syracuse University, and I went on for a little bit longer to get another master's degree in education.
That was at Syracuse also?
Yes, at Syracuse.
Wow, very cool. And then was it out of your studies in Syracuse that you then went right into playing with the Goldman Band, or was there some time in between?
Well, no, I went back to New York, and this time went by, and I expected to be in the Goldman Band because I knew all the fellows in it. I'd played with them in other bands, and I got a chance to audition, and Richard Franco Goldman accepted me, and I started playing in the band in 1965.
Wow. What was that audition process like, auditioning for the Goldman Band?
Well, I auditioned in front of Richard at his home in New York, and he had me play some solos, and he accepted me in the Goldman Band in 1965.
Wow.
It sounds like a very similar audition process to sometimes in the older days of the Marine Band. I was reading a book. It's called Guaranteed Notes, and it's by three brothers, the Erdman brothers. All three of them were in the Marine Band, and the two older brothers detailed a very similar audition process where they went down and auditioned for the director, played a few solos, and it was a kind of a yes or no just based off the solos.
And Jimmy Burke, who did the solos in the Goldman Band, had an illness that he wasn't able to stand up and play the solos some more. And I did get an opportunity in 1971 to guest conduct. And also it was an opportunity for me to play a group of solos. And this was all at Lincoln Center at the band show.
You remember what you played?
My very first solo with the Goldman Band, I'll never forget. I did two movements of the Haydn Trumpet Concerto from memory.
Wow. There you go.
Very good.
And I'll remember the buzz. And I got through it, and it was straight ahead. I did a group of 6 or 7 more solos that year, and I continued to play the solos for the next several years.
Wow. So they played at Lincoln Center. Were most of their engagements in New York City, or did they go on tour as well?
Well, not on tour, but we played at outside dates occasionally, rarely. But
Gotcha.
When I started with the band, we also played in Central Park and Prospect Park. And Central Park got to be too dangerous for the band, so it ended up being strictly at Naumburg or the band show outside of at Lincoln Center, and it was 6 concerts a week, and it was a summer job. Was 8 weeks and 6 concerts a week with 1.5 days of rehearsals.
And then was it while you were in the Goldman Band that you then started getting your doctorate?
I started a little before the Goldman Band, and I was able to secure from Richard and his sister all of the press books. So I had primary sources, which were very unique. And I worked on the doctorate while in the Goldman Band, and I got the doctorate, PhD from NYU in 1971.
Gotcha. Very cool. So I know a lot of listeners to the podcast are very familiar with the Ken Burns documentary, the Civil War, and are thus very familiar with you, even though they may not know it. You are the founder of the Old Bethpage Village Brass Band. Am I correct?
No, you're incorrect.
I am incorrect.
I was Old Bethpage Village had a brass band, but it was more like a parade band, a farmer's band, parade band. I professionalized it when I took it over in 1977, and I secured professional musicians who were paid for their services at the village. And also, as I said, the previous band leader sought out parades. I sought out concerts and libraries and concert situations because it was not a full-time job. At Old Bethpage, we had maybe 10 full-time band, which was 11-piece band, and a sextet to stretch the money. And when I performed several concerts at libraries and wherever I could, I played the same music, but I had to be careful with the sextet because I gave a historic performance and lecture, sort of trying to keep it detailed, the purpose of the band and the music and the times of the brass band.
Yeah, for sure.
Jolly, would you mind telling us a little bit more about Old Bethpage Village restoration? And I understand now it's kind of like a historical village that's been restored, and people can go visit some of the houses and experience the living history there.
It's a very nice place, and they have established certain weekends for the Long Island Fair. And to me, the brass band is a very important feature because they don't always stay with the historic. It's a historic farming community, and lately the brass band has maintained its historic presence, and I introduce each selection and try to place it historically in perspective to the village.
Yeah, I think from what I remember about the village itself, I think wasn't the land where the village stands now originally just a farm, and then Nassau County lifted and brought houses to that land to create a village? Like the village wasn't there as it stands now previously. Is that right?
No, they created a village and various houses and a school and a church, and a community center or an inn, and it's quite an attraction. And they try to maintain historical accuracy where they can. But I believe the band illustrates that historic nature of the village better than it's getting away from the village, but they will let it divert. But the band is a historic band, and we don't play modern music. We play authentic music from the period on period instruments, and we try to do it in the style of the mid 19th century, the 1850s and 60s, 70s.
So when you took over the band at Old Bethpage, was that an arrangement that you had with the village? Like, did they approach you and ask you to create a Civil War brass band for concerts, or did you approach them? How did that work?
No, a committee was formed to improve the quality of the band, and they came to me because they asked around, and I was playing in all the groups in the Long Island area, mm-hmm. and I was approached to professionalize the band, and I took it over, and I did not start it, mm-hmm. but these musicians, and they're still playing, but without me. I've retired a couple of years ago. But I professionalized it, and these are some of the finest players on Long Island.
Now, did you have experience with Civil War brass band music prior to creating this group?
No, I had no experience with the Civil War, but this sort of turned me on to it. So I started doing research on the music and the various bands throughout the country, and I sought out arrangements that would fulfill the quality of the brass band. I mean, I didn't turn away from music because it was hard, but the previous band was playing all simple marches, and these were the most intricate music I could find, and we did it well.
Yeah, I know. The band that Steven and I play in, one of our things that we like to tell the audience is that the music that they're hearing, the instruments that played it had only existed for a few short decades before this music was being played on them. And the music is pretty darn hard. So we find it very interesting that the difficulty and the engaging quality of the music was being played on relatively new technology at the time.
Well, the difficulty of the music, I challenged the band, and I played first E-flat lead, and the instrumentation was 2 E-flat cornets, 2 B-flat cornets, 2 alto horns, 2 baritone horns, a tuba, and a bass drum and a snare drum. 11 pieces. And at the village, we didn't always play with the 11 pieces. Sometimes, as I said, due to the finances, we would use a sextet and have 1 E-flat cornet, 1 B-flat, 1 alto, 1 baritone, a tuba, and 1 drum. And we used to play at libraries when they couldn't come up with our fee for 11 pieces, which I prefer to play because of the fullness of the sound. But in order to spread the Civil War brass band music, I would play with the sextet.
Yeah, so a lot of the listeners I know, Stephen, know that my experience, or the reason why, this podcast exists and why I'm involved in Civil War era music, is because I heard my dad growing up performing in the Old Bethpage Brass Band, attending the Long Island Fair, hearing you guys play on weekends and stuff. And it's been incredibly impactful on my music upbringing. And we model our own brass band, the 8th GM Regiment Band in Fairfax, largely on what I remember the Old Bethpage Brass Band doing. We have the small sextet that goes out for most of our engagements, but a lot of times when the finances call for fewer players. And we go all the way up to 10, 11, 12. I think the most we can do is 14, I think, at the moment.
Did you ever play in the Old Bethpage Brass Band?
So my first ever paid gig was at the Longwood Fair with the Old Bethpage Brass Band. I was playing the bass drum. So that was my first experience getting paid to play, and my first time getting to play in the brass band as well.
It was exciting for me to be involved, and I started doing all kinds of research on early bands and contacting various people like Paul Mayberry, who was the guru of Civil War brass band music. He had a catalog, and Mark Elrod provided me with a lot of music and advice, and I contacted various brass band leaders and found out what they were playing, and developed a very good library, which still is I turned it over to Old Bethpage, and it ended up being very sizable. And it started out with just very small, and they would prefer the simple marches.
And Dr. Jolly, you mentioned a little bit about the instrumentation of the band, and you mentioned that the band plays on period instruments. How did the band acquire those instruments? Are they personal instruments? Did the village acquire them somehow, or where did all those horns come from?
The village had a group of instruments, but a lot of the players who I brought into the band had a period instrument, and I had a collection of 21 brass instruments, and I would bring the extra horns in case one of them went bad. But we did play strictly on period instruments, and we did not play strictly on period mouthpieces. I used a Bach 3C mouthpiece, and it worked. And for those hard first E flat parts, it was a challenge. And so the village had a group of instruments, but they were not sufficiently quality instruments.
Did you ever try to play a Civil War gig on one of those flat-rimmed, sharp cookie cutter mouthpieces, or not even bother?
I didn't even bother. I tried them, and in order to be a good first E-flat lead player, I had to use a current mouthpiece, a Bach. And we did perform at the New York Brass Conference, and one of my favorite remembrances is Vacchiano and Voisin in the audience, and they came over and looked at my rotary bell front E-flat, and they had high praise for the band.
Wow.
And it was unique. I should have remembered to take a picture with Vacchiano, who I studied with, and Roger Voisin, and both of them had experiences with the Civil War brass band music, and they were thrilled to be in the audience, and I was thrilled to see them there.
Yeah, wow, that's really special. You mentioned Paul Mayberry earlier. Did you start playing in the Yankee Brass Band after you got involved with Old Bethpage?
Yes. The Yankee Brass Band had started, and I was approached by Mark Elrod, who was a regular with Paul Mayberry conducting the brass band. So in 1988, I started to make the annual trip up to New England, and for this 1 week, a solid, 2.5 days of rehearsals and 6 concerts. And I didn't do solos that first year. And I don't know, soon afterwards, maybe the second or third year, I was the first chair player, and I always did a solo, one of the tricky ones for E-flat cornet.
Yeah.
The saxa.
Yeah, like the Yankee Doodle variations, those type of things.
Yes, Yankee Doodle variations.
Yeah, very cool. And then you mentioned also about acquiring all the different music from all your different sources for the Old Bethpage Brass Band. When the band would play in the village, were you guys reading off of scans of the original handwritten parts, or were you guys reading new engraved, newly arranged versions of those period pieces? Like, what did you guys actually read off of?
Music stands, and Paul Mayberry had restructured them in the style of the Civil War brass band, so it would be authentic. And although some of the books that we actually, Peter's Saxhorn Journal and Eaton's 12 Pieces of Harmony, we played from the books. But I do have some original music, the Port Royal Band books and the Manchester Cornet Band music. With the Yankee Brass Band, we played quite often in Manchester, New Hampshire, and I would visit the Manchester Historical Society, and where they had copies of the Manchester Cornet Band library, which you would be able to secure and copy and pay them to have actually Manchester Cornet Band music.
So I know when we've tried to read off of original handwritten parts, that music can, not only are the notes difficult themselves, but then there's another layer of difficulty just trying to decipher some of the chicken scratch that's on the page sometimes. Yeah. Did you guys kind of struggle with that sometimes also with the Old Bethpage?
No, we got used to it, and with the repeated performance, it got to be sort of easy for us. And it's never easy on the first E flat because it's some of the things are very high and treacherous and technical. And as the leader, I felt obligated to do it well.
For sure, definitely. In terms of uniforms, what did you prefer the players in the Old Bethpage Brass Band to be wearing?
Well, we had inherited Civil War military uniforms, and we wore them. And then a couple years later, we had a bright red with white striping on it, and we sort of outgrew them. The band was full of big guys, and in the heat of the summer, we had a military shirt we would wear, and with a kepi hat, and we always, in order to look well, we used white gloves and wear appropriately. And the red and white uniforms were very striking. And as I said, the guys had to be a little smaller in order to make use of them.
Were those red uniforms meant to represent like the Marine Band or anything, or why red uniform?
No, just a military flashy uniform with the white shako hats with the plume on it and the white gloves. On the picture of the cover of the recording, it's striking, to see the red and white. But more typically, we played in the blue frock coats and the kepi hat, and and the black belt.
Yeah, very, very standard, very clean looking, very appropriate.
Yes, and it got to be a cleaning process, so they had to be cleaned every year. And the band is still playing a lot of the same guys, but without me. And I always felt that they didn't use the band to its fullest. And right now, I think the main purpose of the band, as the school groups come to visit the village, the band lines up and marches them in, and it gets the feeling of a parade.
Yeah, yeah. I remember following the brass band from the visitor center, from the main building where the parking is, and following the band as they marched down the dirt roads past the old baseball field where they were playing baseball with the old time rules, and you would march to, I think, the tavern, right, and play concerts under the tree behind the tavern.
Yes, the big shade tree, and that was our favorite spot. We would alternate with the other historic instruments. We would do a half-hour set, and then the historic instruments, fiddle and xylophone or the zither, they would play the dancing, and then we would probably play together one tune for a grand march, and then continue as a solo with the band, and give the dancers a rest.
And this was for the schools that were visiting the village, like private events. Private.
That was a regular routine, and the schools sort of went to the various houses and saw how they cooked and visited the church and the cemetery, and it had a schedule. We were contracted, and as I understand, Ed Albinski, who handles it now for me, has a 3-year contract. And he says there's a few more dates on it. It wasn't a regular thing where the band would be playing every weekend for certain events, and the Long Island Fair and other musical events, specialty dates of importance in the Civil War, where the band would be most useful.
Yeah, yeah.
So do you consider the band to be kind of under that umbrella of Civil War reenactors, or is the mission of the band more to kind of preserve and educate about the brass music of the time, separately than the war, or do they mix, or kind of what is the mission and the goal of the band?
Well, I feel the mission of the band is to preserve and maintain accurately the early history of the band and how we got to where we are today with this. And it's a reenacting, but it's really, I thought we were a brass band from the Civil War. It wasn't a reenactment. It was an action.
Right. And do you think that the Old Bethpage Brass Band is one of the few ensembles with this mission, or do you think that that there's a number of bands throughout the country, or maybe not enough bands throughout the country doing this type of thing? Where do you think Old Bethpage sits in relation to other people doing the same thing?
It's a unique position to be contracted, but there are a lot of bands, community bands, like during the Civil War. I mean, every town had a band, and sometimes the band marched out with the troops during the Civil War. But there's still a lot of brass bands, but it takes a lot to maintain the presence, and it's not. You have to sell it,
Yeah,
and
sure. It's a very expensive mission to want to be carrying out. So you need to do it well.
Yes, thank goodness the county payroll contract, they set it up so the Bethpage is a county operation, and one of the things I think they are paying tribute to have the band there, but they're slipping away from that, and the band helps to maintain the historic atmosphere and just the sound of the band, in the village. And sometimes they have historic events, and like Teddy Roosevelt will give a speech, but yet they have the Long Island Fair where they sometimes forget the nature of the historic presence of the village, and just to draw the people out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I remember I just read a quote in one of the books that I've been reading about the power of the brass band during the time of the Civil War, and the person mentioned that hearing the sound of a brass band for the soldiers was better than rations and medicine, that it was so uplifting and took care of them so well that it was better than rations or medicine.
Yeah. Okay, well, the brass bands served a purpose, and sometimes they would alternate over the battle. One band would play from the north, and the bands in the south would play. Sometimes they would play together.
Yeah. And then you were implying with the band being contracted by the county and its current status at Old Bethpage, back in its heyday, how many times a year do you think the Old Bethpage Village Brass Band was going out and giving public performances?
Well, not as much as at the village. We had a schedule, but I turned to promotion, and I wrote to every library and groups that were putting on art shows and concerts in the parks. And I would say at most the outside performance would be maybe 10 a year. Mm-hmm. But we didn't have to rehearse because we had a program that, again, bringing history to the people in this concert. Whether it would be inside or outside in the park. And so this purpose of the band, it's a forgotten thing, and we tried to preserve it.
Yeah.
And something that really has reached a very wide audience that the band has been involved in was Ken Burns' Civil War documentary. How did that all kind of come together? How did the band get involved with that project?
Well, see, I don't really know how I got involved in so many things, but my reputation, I'm sure they asked around, and I was approached, and we did a record date, and we recorded many other things, and they weren't always used. And the Ashokan Farewell, which is not a Civil War song, we recorded, and it wasn't used. I think it would be kind of bright, but the theme music on the fiddle and the piano was poignant, but I really don't know. And we had a record date, and we did it, and I was happy to see. We didn't know what it was for.
Oh, wow. Was that a recording session in New York City, or where did you guys have to go
Yes.
to record that? Yeah, New York.
In New York City.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. And then you were telling me the other day when we spoke on the phone that the brass band, in addition to its recognition on that soundtrack, that you guys also recorded 2 other albums.
Yes, at the Village. One album, a 12-inch, we had reproduced as a CD, and another CD, just to preserve and maintain and something to pass out and possibly make a little money. And we made very little money from it, but it's a good representation of what we perform at the Village. And we didn't take full advantage of, the band, we spent a week, we brought to Ireland, and we performed in the St. Patrick's Parade in Dublin in 1992. And we were playing for the Lloyd Mayor's Ball in the evening, and they came over to me with a big statue, an award as a first place best brass band, best small brass band in the parade. And I ended up carrying it through Ireland.
That's really cool. Wow. Do you?
Yeah, I'm looking at it right now. It's on my piano, at top of my piano, and we did do a thing in Canada for Upper Canada Village, which was a working community for Victoria Day, and we did parade around the village, and it was just a single happening where we were hired to emphasize the cooperation of the brass bands with Canada.
Mm-hmm. And kind of continuing to go off of this idea of other notable performances that you guys got to do. I remember when I reached out and met BJ Pino for the first time from the Wildcat Regiment Band and mentioned that I, grew up listening to the Old Bethpage Brass Band and my dad played tuba there. He mentioned that you guys had gone to home Pennsylvania, I think with a small group, and played there with, was that with the Wildcat Regiment?
No, we played with the full 11-piece band. And it was like a band festival. His band played, and we alternated with them. And we did a parade through the village and to the university, and that was, I thought, a very important thing that I would like to see reproduced in other communities. But BJ was very, he has a wonderful band, and he really tries to maintain the Civil War feeling as far as uniforms and music, and it's a regular thing with him. It's not really a job, but see, I took it on, and my musicians are professionals. They are paid. This is one of the problems, to come up with enough money to do a lot of concerts.
Yeah.
And thank goodness the county, I understand they're doing more concerts this year, but it still leaves far few to be performed, and it should be spread more widely.
Definitely. Something that the last BJ Pino's a very good friend of the band that Steven and I play in here in Fairfax, and the last time I went up to see him in Pennsylvania, we had a pretty lengthy conversation about the environment in which Civil War brass bands are playing for their audiences, and he was mentioning how he noticed over time how either interest was slowly going down or people were becoming more confrontational with certain music that was being played. I was curious with your experience playing in a brass band on Long Island, so very much in Northern Territory, if you ever experienced any pushback from anybody in a concert or any type of interest either increasing or decreasing over your time working with the Old Bethpage Brass Band?
No, it was difficult because the people were used to a different kind of music, and to be hit in the face with it, it wasn't especially liked, and it was our mission to perform it so that it would be more appealing to them. And the sound was unique and not what would be expected. And even if we played it on modern instruments, the music would not travel well. Playing on the old instruments, and we tried to force it on them, and they go across the street to the other music.
Yeah, I'm wondering if it's just because I know other bands are experiencing it also, but us being in Northern Virginia, where sentiment of the Civil War could go either way at times, some of our performances we've been challenged on already. We've had people confront us about the music that we're playing or what we're representing. So that's interesting that that's happening here in Virginia, but you're saying you didn't really experience any of that type of pushback up on Long Island.
No, I don't take any pushback. I'm determined to play the best I can and present a quality story line about the music and about the times and the purpose of the band. And I sort of present it as I know it to be and hope that the people will enjoy it.
Mm-hmm. And did you ever notice that your time at the Village, audiences were becoming more engaged with it in a positive way, or was attendance maybe slowly decreasing the further away from the centennial maybe that we got, or any experience with that?
Well, the bigger the crowd, the more they enjoyed the band, and they sort of got with it. And it was the start of the band program. It would attract more and more people, but you need a crowd, and it was just another activity at the Village, and it was just something to sit around and enjoy the atmosphere and the quality, and the band would take them back to Civil War times.
Mm-hmm. And you guys did it so well. Like I said, I guess even me, just personally, having been brought up listening to you and the Old Bethpage Brass Band is what's got the band at George Mason University existing and this podcast existing. But your influence in the field is rather significant. So things were done very well under your leadership at the Old Bethpage Village.
As I said, I did not start the band. It was given to me.
Yep.
To professionalize, and I feel I did it very well. It became a good band and an accurate band, in tune, playing not the easiest music, but we tackled the hard music, and that's the way to maintain the band's interest in playing this music. We did it, and we struggled with it at first, and little by little, we got so that we were good at it.
Mm-hmm. And get good at it, you guys did. Great. So that about wraps up everything that I had. Is there anything maybe that you have on the front of your mind that we didn't necessarily address directly that you wanted to mention about either your experience with Civil War music or Old Bethpage in particular or anything like that?
Well, I have met a lot of people through the brass band music, especially Paul Mayberry. He has been a guru of old brass music, and he will take a sheet music and create a Civil War arrangement. And one of the reasons I wanted to play in the Yankee Brass Band, he would come up with new things every year. And I visited Mark Elrod at his home in the Washington area, and he provided me with boxes of music. He said, "You don't have this? Well, you got to have this and this." And the job I had was trying to promote the band performances and also develop the band quality-wise and repertoire wise. And it was a chore, but it was, I just did it. And I don't know how I survived, but I enjoyed the music, and I enjoyed the challenge, and I was very happy to be a part of the Old Bethpage Brass Band.
And we're thankful for you having taken over that band for sure. All right. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Jolly, for speaking with Stephen and I today. I keep on saying I can't thank you enough for coming out, and for your expertise in brass bands is largely why even this podcast exists. So thank you.
I appreciate being a party to helping understand the brass band movement, and I find it difficult with the cell phone to my ear, and it's not the same as being in front of an audience.
Mm-hmm. For sure.
Right. Well, I think we all look forward to getting back to being able to do those in-person interviews and concerts. For sure.
Yeah, so we're all stuck inside at the moment with the health crisis.
Yes. Currently, I'm staying at home.
Yeah, as we all are.
Right.
All righty, Dr. Jolly.
Good luck with your project. Good luck,
okay,
you and Stephen. Chris.
Thank
Thanks.
you. Thank you. Take care.
Bye now.
Really, really great. Thank you again to Dr. Kirby Jolly for taking the time to speak with Stephen and I. Really incredible to have Dr. Kirby Jolly talk about his experience with the Old Bethpage Brass Band. It was really interesting hearing one of the earlier pioneers of this genre talk about his experience with the band and just his thoughts on Civil War brass bands in the era. The thing that really struck me was when he was saying that they didn't consider themselves to be reenactors. He said we were a Civil War brass band. They were what was he saying? He was enacting, right? Not reenacting. He was enacting. Right.
Yeah.
So really cool.
Yeah, it's always great to get perspective from someone who's been involved in this research and in this performance practice for so long. So that was really special to get to talk to him.
If you have any questions for us regarding this episode, or if you want us to forward any questions to Dr. Kirby Jolly, you could email us at our email address, eabb.podcast@gmail.com, or you can follow us on Facebook or Instagram and send us a message through that way as well.
And it would be great if you feel so inclined to leave a rating and a review of the show on Apple Podcasts. That really helps boost our show in search results, and we'd appreciate hearing from you over there on Apple Podcasts as well.
Our featured album for episode number 4 is going to be titled The Yankee Brass Band. Now, this isn't the Yankee Brass Band that Dr. Kirby Jolly was mentioning in this album. This is the title of the album from 1981 by the American Brass Quintet brass band. It's similar to last episode's featured album with the Empire Brass Quintet, how they were primarily 5 brass musicians, but then they brought in friends to supplement the quintet to play a full brass band. The American Brass Quintet did a similar thing with this album and actually 2 other albums. This album released in 1981, playing primarily music famous in the North at the time, and then it was re-released in, Stephen, was it 1992?
Yeah, it was re-released in July of 1992 on CD.
Great. So that is our featured album for this episode. Feel free to go on our website, eabbpodcast.com, and look in the show notes for episode number 4 and read up on the American Brass Quintet Brass Band's album, The Yankee Brass Band. We thank you guys so much for listening to episode number 4, and we look forward to speaking with you alongside you next time. Thank you.
Talk to you then.